Hello everyone and welcome to Navigating the Challenges of Unconscious Bias. My name is Tony Ragunanan. I want to make this as practical as possible. In other words, to humanize the experience based on the challenges that are actually common in the workplace. This is not a training session on unconscious bias. It is an opportunity to define what unconscious bias is and to remind us to be aware of how it can impact us and the 5 ways to address it as we move forward. Unconscious bias radically influences how we make decisions by impacting our perception and reaction to others. For individuals, some forms of unconscious bias are difficult to override, even if they know that it is wrong, because they are deeply ingrained in our thinking. Studies have shown that we could at least make some shifts in our behavior. I want to give you a personal story. It's not work related, but years ago, I used to go to this plumber to buy plumbing supplies. But every time I go there, he would talk to me like if I am a plumber, using terminology I can't understand. These are challenges that we see every day. He has good intentions, but he is not aware of his unconscious challenge. And eventually, I simply stopped going. Now, I could have told him about it, but he didn't seem like the type of person who could receive some negative feedback. And I could have been wrong about that. And this is something we all have to be aware of. Sometimes we are not aware of the environment we create based on our own communication styles. And we will go into that in more detail. Patricia Devine, psychology professor and director of the Prejudice Lab, says that there are a lot of people who are very sincere in their renunciation of prejudice, yet they are vulnerable to habits of mind. Intentions are not good enough. So let's go into what is unconscious bias. Unconscious bias or implicit bias is often defined as prejudice or unsupported judgments in favor of or against one thing, person, or group as compared to another, in a way that is usually considered unfair. This is different from conscious bias or explicit bias, which is to be aware, intentional, and responsive. Every time you make a decision, your social background, life experiences, personal and cultural values influence your reasoning. And this develops through a variety of conditioning. The first one is classical conditioning. This is where something may have happened to you in the past. Maybe you have eaten something or had a bad experience with somebody. And when you re-experience it, you have this automatic reaction to that situation. Next is instrumental conditioning. If someone decides to reward you, you would do the work because of that reward. This is instrumental conditioning. And then there's social learning, where if you are in an environment where others are behaving in a certain way, you may eventually begin to behave that way. And this is how unconscious bias usually starts. There's a popular analogy where if you put a frog into boiling water, he will jump out immediately. However, if you put a frog in cold water and you start heating up the water gradually, the frog will eventually stay there and die. And this is what happens to many of us. It is so habitual for us to behave in certain ways, to approach people in certain ways, to create an environment that is unconscious around us. And this happens to many of us. And we may have problems that we don't know we have. If you have had a bad experience with someone in your life, or you have been having a bad experience with someone in your life, and you are not doing anything about it, the problem keeps getting worse and worse. And this is something that we have to address. The idea is to get out of the pot. Sometimes you don't know that you have the problem. So this is what we will talk about. How bias affects our decision making and behavior. There's something called a ladder of inference. This is where you have a pool of available data and you select data from that pool. You make assumptions based on the data you have selected and you draw conclusions from that. And then you develop certain beliefs and take action based on those beliefs. There's a reflexive loop. Our beliefs affect what data we select the next time. When we choose data a second time, or third time, or fourth time, sometimes we choose data that really represents our beliefs. Imagine this. You bought an older home and began to remodel one of the rooms. However, you noted that one window, which measured 2 feet horizontally by 2 feet vertically, let in an inadequate amount of light. Seeking a resolution to this problem, you took your saw and made the opening larger. With pride, you surveyed your work, noting that a significantly increased amount of sunlight now poured through to brighten the room. However, when you again measured the dimensions of the window, you found that it still measured 2 feet by 2 feet. How do you explain such a phenomenon? For many people, this is a bit confusing because people go to the square window. I never said it was a square window. It can actually be a circular window or kite-shaped window or many other shapes that may fit inside of a square or even inside of a circle. Many people with this problem, they make the assumption that it is a square window. there are many blocks to creativity. Making assumptions, over-reliance on logic, analytical rules, and fear of failure creates thinking boundaries. If you look at this picture, many of you will notice that there are two squirrels on a tree. But if you take a closer look, or if you look at it from a distance, or take a picture with your phone, you will see that it is actually a woman's face. Look at this one. If I ask you how many trees were here, typically people will look at the roots and say 5 trees. But the man is chopping a tree that has no top. And the bird is pecking at a tree that has no base. So it's unreliable information. Therefore, we shouldn't share this information. Famous artist Salvador Dali created this sculpture, which was eventually turned into a painting. If you look at this painting, you could see negative body language. If I ask you, what do you think he was thinking? What he was thinking here is that we store information. In order to find out what is in those compartments, we really have to develop good relationships that are based on trust. And lastly, what do you see here? It's just a lion. We shouldn't be jumping to any conclusions. We tend to seek out patterns. Unconscious bias occurs because of the brain's natural tendency to look for patterns and associations in the world. When we think that something is true, we look for anything that will confirm it to us. Eventually, we fall prey to seeing things that are not there. We like to take shortcuts. It is our tendency to try to simplify the world. Carl Jung once said, "Thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge." Let's look at this problem. A bat and a ball costs $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Many people also in this problem jump at 10 cents. But the ball doesn't cost 10 cents. The ball would cost 5 cents and the bat would cost $1.05. But we fall prey to seeing things unconsciously. Many of us will jump at the 10 cents. Our experience and conditioning, cultural conditioning, like we mentioned before, media portrayals, and upbringing can all contribute to the unconscious associations that people form. So let's look at the types of unconscious bias. And these are really self-explanatory. Let's look at the first one, affinity bias. Affinity bias occurs when you unconsciously prefer someone because they remind you of yourself or people you know and like. Anchoring bias, being overly influenced by the first piece of information we receive. It is also known as the first impression bias. Halo and horns effect. The halo effect occurs when we focus on one particularly great attribute, ignoring all other flaws or defects, while the horns effect involves concentrating solely on one negative characteristic despite other more positive ones. The confirmation bias, placing more value on information that supports our existing beliefs. This leads us to reject any information that opposes our beliefs. This is attributed to two main cognitive mechanisms. Challenge avoidance, which is the desire to avoid finding out that you are wrong. Reinforcement seeking, which is the desire to find out that you are right. Conformity bias. Conformity bias is the tendency people have to act similar to the people around them, regardless of their own personal beliefs, also known as peer pressure. Rituals moved us into habits. Habits are unconscious. Now we have to transition from the unconscious to the conscious. Sigmund Freud believed that bringing the contents of unconscious into awareness was important for relieving psychological distress. Now we have to increase the level of objectivity, being based on facts and not influenced by personal feelings or beliefs. So now let's look at the 5 ways to address unconscious bias. 1. Recognize how your experiences may have shaped your perspectives. This is all about self-awareness. In 1936, psychologist Kurt Lewin published the equation that behavior is a function of a person in an environment. If I ask you, when was the first time that you experienced an environment? You could go back from the start of school, when you were born, but even before that, we were in the womb. And that environment shaped our behaviors to a certain extent. Now, what I want you to take from this is that you create an environment around yourself. All of us create environments around ourselves. And that dictates how people respond to us. Also, 2, recognize how their experiences may have shaped their perspectives. These are the people you interact with. Remember, they have had experiences as well. And they are creating an environment that allows you to dictate how you react around them. Are they really difficult? And I put difficult in inverted commas. Maybe they have been too aggressive, so you don't tell them what you need to tell them when you need to tell them. Now let's look at this picture of a tree. The reason the leaves look like that is because of the roots. We can't see roots. And this is an analogy to represent what we see in people. We can't see their experiences. What we see is how they respond to things. We see their personality. We see their behaviors. 3, think about how your actions and the environment you created may have impacted others. So like I said before, you have created an environment. Now we have to be more objective. Understand, what type of relationship do you have with each person around you? And why is that relationship the way it is? Ask yourself these questions. For example, are you aware of how you show up, your communication style? How would you rate your level of trust between individuals? What is the level of psychological safety you feel with your team? I'm going to talk about each one of these very briefly. Firstly, are you aware of how you show up, your communication style? Now I'm going to look at 4 communication styles here. Driver personality is the person who takes charge and wants solutions. The analytical person is the person who values the accuracy and details. The expressive person is the idea person. And the amiable person is the person who prioritizes relationships. Now we have all 4 of these communication styles within us. It's just that one is usually dominant under normal conditions. For example, the driver may want things to be done quickly. The analytical likes to take their time. And what do we need when we have conflict? Maybe we need a deadline. We need a conversation. This is what we have to do. The expressive person, for example, are the people who sometimes don't listen for a long time. You have to give them their ideas really quickly. Sometimes they may be looking at you, but they're not there because you are taking too long to tell them something. You are taking too long to get your message across. And the amiable people, they want to make sure that everyone gets along. But that could also be very annoying, especially for drivers. One thing to take away here is that no style is better than another. Any style can be effective depending on the circumstances we are in. Let's look at this diagram for a minute. You'll notice that we have high and low sociability as well as high and low dominance. The expressives and drivers tend to be very high in terms of dominance. Usually if you have a team building activity, for instance, those are the types of personalities that would jump into things. The amiable and analyticals, on the other hand, they are very low in dominance, even though the amiable is very high on sociability, and the analyticals are very low on sociability. And these are just some of the differences that we will see within people. These explanations a lot of the times are unconscious within us. Sometimes we don't understand or we don't realize where we may be falling short. So how would you rate your level of trust between individuals? This is taken from the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. The absence of trust is placed at the bottom as trust is the foundation of any team. This absence of trust stems from the inability or unwillingness to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is consciously choosing to freely express your thoughts, feelings, and opinions regardless of what others might think of you. It is being able to show or express a weakness if there is one. Without trust, a team cannot hope to have constructive and helpful dialogue. There will be a fear of conflict. This will create artificial harmony. For example, I may think that everything is okay, but if I'm not being approachable or open to feedback, colleagues will not trust me enough to talk to me. A lack of healthy conflict from the previous dysfunction creates an environment where team members are unable to buy into the decision-making process. This creates a lack of commitment. Without feeling comfortable to express their opinions about a decision, they are unlikely to feel passionate or committed to the results of that decision. It becomes difficult to criticize a peer or hold each other accountable for behavior, effort, and performance. This creates an atmosphere of low standards. This leads to an inattention to results. Ego and personal status get in the way of collective success, but it all starts with trust. Patrick Lencioni also said, if we don't trust one another, then we aren't going to engage in open, constructive, ideological conflict. So what is the psychological safety you feel with your team? Psychological safety describes an environment where individuals feel they can speak up, offer ideas, and ask questions without fear of being ridiculed by members of their team. Let's look at the difference between trust and psychological safety. Psychological safety focuses on a belief about a group norm, but trust focuses on a belief that one person has about another person. If we look at this diagram on the left, you will see that under the word trust, will you give others the benefit of the doubt when you take a risk? An example of this, Bob is probably going to freak out if I disagree with him. So there is no trust between you and Bob. In terms of psychological safety, will others give you the benefit of the doubt when you take a risk? My team expects me to speak up. It's how we do things. One thing we have to be really careful about is your perception of difficult people. What is difficult? We tend to give people labels. For example, let's go back to the communication styles. A driver personality may find the analytical personality to be difficult, but it's not really that they are difficult, it's just they are different in terms of how they do their work. And then we tend to give labels. We tend to call people certain names, but there is no solution in that. We have to look at what is that person's behavior like for us to refer to them as difficult. I put the picture of a snow globe here because this is what happens to us, at least internally, when we have conflict with others. For example, if you and I have an argument and you walk away and I walk away, what is going on in our mind is that we have this snow globe that is shaken up in our minds. And the only way for us to have that conversation is to leave it for it to settle. Now, we have experienced these things all our lives. Some people have had experiences from childhood where their snow globe is still shaken up in their mind. And because of that, they may behave differently around certain people, places, or things that they experience. Our refusal to talk about and confront issues reinforces unconscious bias because things don't get dealt with. Let's look at number 4, managing your emotions, the threat of the emotional hijack. This is a triune model of the brain. Our brain is made up of 3 distinct sections. The reptilian brain, which is the first part of the brain to develop. It's instinctual, or dinosaur brain is sometimes called. We have instinctive behavior. This is where unconscious bias usually comes from. There's also the limbic region, or emotional or feeling brain. This is the second part of our brain to develop. And then eventually, we have the neocortex, which is the rational or thinking brain. This is where there is logic and reasoning. In some cases, in an emotional hijack, I don't know if many of you may have experienced people who have lost control. Doesn't usually go well when we try to control them because the limbic region has temporarily overtaken in the rational or thinking brain, which is the neocortex. And this is actually seen on MRI scans. So what we have to do is be more objective about our experiences. Ask the questions so that you can make better decisions, so that you are affected less by them. Lastly, structure your decision making. And I go back to the ladder of inference. For example, if someone asks you to do something, if someone gives you a task, define the criteria of the task, define the specifications. Did they give you a deadline? Did they give you a format? Whatever you need to ask. Get to the bottom of what they are asking for. From the pool of available data, you could select the right data, make the right assumptions, make the right conclusions, have the right beliefs, and take the right action. These 5 things that we spoke about are all related. So let's look at some key takeaways. Look at yourself first to identify areas where you can be more objective, whether you are dealing with people, with tasks, or with situations. The ability to develop trust with those around you begins with vulnerability. Remember, I told you before, vulnerability is not a weakness. Be aware of the environment you create. It will help you to improve the relationships around you. Adapt to those who have a different communication style. Remember, we are all different. We have all of those styles within us, but under normal conditions, there is one that is dominant. Have the conversations that will clear up expectations, improve situations, and strengthen relationships. Psychologist Jennifer Everhart says, there is hope in the sheer act of reflection. This is where the power lies and how the process starts. Thank you for listening.